everyone. In this video we will look at what are tuples in Python. Okay, so we would discuss what are tuples, how do we create a tuple, how do we check the particular elements, the inbuilt methods. Then we'll focus our attention on how to change or delete the items in a tuple or delete the tuple itself. And finally, we will end our discussion by discussing what are the advantages of tuples over lists. So, coming to the first question, what are tuples? Tuples are very similar to lists. The only difference between a tuple and a list is that once you define a tuple, you cannot change those items. So tuples are immutable, whereas lists were mutable. That is, once you define a list, you could always change the elements in the list. But when it comes to a tuple, the elements remain fixed and you cannot change those elements. Now coming to the next part, that is how do we create a tuple. For this, let's switch to a Jupyter notebook and see how we do these things. Okay, so now I'm in the Jupyter notebook. So let's create an empty tuple first. So I'm going to call this as my tuple. And to create a tuple, all we have to do is give a list of, give a set of parentheses. Okay. And once we run this, and if you check the type of my tuple, you would say that Python is saying it's a tuple. Okay. Now let's create our first tuple with some elements in it. So I'm going to give the same name my tuple, but this time let's keep it very simple. Let's take the first three numbers, so 1 comma 2 comma 3. So this is the first tuple that we have created. Like lists, even here we can have mixed data types inside a single tuple. So for example, let's say I define another tuple and I give it the same name my tuple, but this time let's give different data types as the elements. So the first element that we have is a string ABC. The next element, let's keep it an integer, say 5000, and after this let's give it a float number, so something like 9.345, some random number I have given. Okay, so here as you can see, as we run this, Python would accept it. So a single tuple can have multiple data types inside it. So this, okay, one very interesting thing that you find for a tuple is that you don't actually have to use this parenthesis for creating a tuple. So let's create the tuple without the parenthesis. So I'm going to call it again my tuple. This time I'm only going to write in the numbers using the comma. So let's say 150 comma 101.101 and let's say DEF. Okay, I haven't used the parentheses anywhere, but if you still run this and now if you check my tuple, you can see Python has automatically given it a tuple format. Okay, now similar to what we have seen in lists and dictionaries, we can also have nested tuples. Okay, so let's create a nested tuple directly. So now I'm going to call this my tuple again. And this time let's keep the first element as ABC. The second element I'm going to pass in a list. Okay, so let's keep it 1, 2 and let's say 100. For the third element I'm going to pass in a tuple. So let's say 500, 600, and 700. So these are the elements of my tuple. One is a string, one is a list, another is a tuple itself. So if we run this, we'll have a my tuple, and if you actually print it out, you can see it is in the form of a tuple. Okay. Now, one interesting thing that you would see is what happens if we want to create a tuple with just one element. So let's try that. So let's say I create my tuple 2, and this time I'm only going to give it a single element ABC. Okay, so we might think that if we just pass in ABC like this is the string, and we have given it parenthesis. So if we run this, Python should take it as a tuple. Okay, but now if we check the type of my tuple 2, something very interesting is happening. Python is not recognizing this as a tuple, but it has taken it as a string. Okay, now what if, although this is a string ABC, but we wanted this to be defined as a tuple and not a string. So the way we can work around this is, if you want a tuple with just one element, there's a small change that you have to make here. And the change is that after writing the element, you have to give it a comma, just to tell Python that make it a tuple and not a string like what we saw in line number 9 and 10. Okay, 9 we just passed in the element, and 10, once we're checking it, it's giving us it as a string. Okay, so if you pass in like this, I've written the element, I've written a comma, and I've left it, and this entire thing is enclosed in parenthesis. Now if we look at this type of my tuple 2, you can see now Python recognizes this as a tuple. So this point you have to remember, that if you have only one element and you're trying to define a tuple, please do not ignore this comma. If you do not put the comma, then by default Python is going to take this particular thing as a string and not a tuple. Okay. Now, like this, we can also index tuples. Okay, so these are ordered pair of numbers just like lists. So every element would have its own number. So let's go back to our tuple called my tuple. The elements were these. Now let's say, okay, let's make it a little simple, and let's define it back to a little simpler thing so that concepts will be more clear. Now let's say I'll go back to this thing like ABC 5000, and what was that, 9.345. Okay, so this is my tuple for the time being. Okay, now let's say I wanted to take out this element 5000 from my tuple. So all we have to do is my tuple of 1 will give me this element 5000. So we have this ordered number, so 0 1 2. So we can simply call on using that order and get our element. Now, what if I wanted the last element, but I don't know how many elements I have in my tuple? Since we have only 3 here, you could simply say my tuple of 2, because it is 0 indexing, and you'll get the value 9.345. But what if our tuple was a huge tuple, and you did not know how, like, you didn't want to check the length of this particular tuple? The easiest way of taking the last element from any tuple or list for that matter is, you can go for the negative indexing. So you can simply say -1, and it will give you the last element. Okay, that was 9.345. Now, if we use, let's try something with the negative indexing. So we know that if you want to take out the first element, that is ABC in our case, all we have to do is my tuple of 0. But I want to take out ABC, but using only negative indexing. I'm not going to use the number 0. So how do we do that? So using negative indexing, the only thing you have to do is you have to know the number of elements. Since we have here 3 elements, okay, and if minus 1 stands for 9.345, this will be minus 2 and ABC will be minus 3. So my tuple of minus 3 should give us our answer ABC. Okay, so that's how the negative indexing is working. Alright.